Hi everyone, Libby and Chieh-Ting here. As you can see, we are not in our studio, and that is because we are coming to you with a very special invitation to SDSP's second annual AI Plus Expo, taking place June 2nd to the 4th, right here in Washington, D.C. at the Convention Center. It's going to be 3 days full of tech demos, company exhibitions, really important conversations about the future of tech and geopolitics, so you don't want to miss it. So be sure to sign up at expo.sdsp.ai. The event is free and open to the public.
And we look straight forward to seeing you there. Welcome to Strait Forward, a podcast about Taiwan, the island at the center of technological innovation and the global fight for democracy. I'm Chieh-Ting Yeh.
And I'm Libby Lange. And Chieh-Ting, I'm sure you saw in the news recently that TSMC announced a $100 billion investment in manufacturing capabilities here in the U.S., right? And that actually comes in addition to a previous $65 billion that they had already committed to manufacturing here.
There was such a different reaction or a mix of reactions in Taiwan and in the U.S. Obviously, here in D.C., we were very excited to see this huge investment announcement. Of course, it's something that the new administration has been pushing for, so that was exciting. But it was very different in Taiwan, right?
Yeah, I think there were mixed reactions, right? I think on the one hand, you had people who saw it in that same positive light, right? Of, Taiwan is really showing what, the kind of strategic and trustworthy partner that it is by making that kind of investment commitment here in the U.S. But I think on the other hand, there are some people who worry that TSMC moving its manufacturing to other countries outside of Taiwan actually might weaken Taiwan's strategic role because, some people call TSMC and Taiwan's chip making abilities something like a silicon shield for Taiwan.
Yeah, and I think that really embodies kind of these mixed feelings about everything that's going on within the United States and Taiwan and between the two countries. It really embodies this kind of fluctuation of U.S. Taiwan relations over the last few decades. And so that's kind of the topic that we want to discuss today, right? Is, you have the tech, you have the geopolitics, and you have the people that are really making everything possible. And how has that relationship evolved? So we're really excited today to have a great conversation with someone who has been following this for a very, very long time. I just want to say, from personal experience, the topic of U.S. Taiwan relations has been very interesting for me because, immigrant parents, right? I have that perspective. People see me and know that my parents are, somebody's not from, perhaps not born in the U.S. And I used to get this a lot where I would say something about Taiwan and people would say, oh, you must really like Thai food or something about Thai food, and I would have to say, no, Thailand is actually a different country, but Taiwanese food is really, really good, right? So you have all these different, I think, misperceptions or misconceptions or misunderstandings about Taiwan in the United States. And on the other hand, I think there's also the flip side where in Taiwan, maybe there are different types of views on the U.S. that we might not necessarily think about here in D.C.
Yeah, no, I also kind of had an interesting experience with this, although maybe on the flip side, right? I actually learned about U.S. Taiwan relations kind of from the Taiwanese perspective first, because of course I didn't maybe know a ton about Taiwan before I went there, but then, I ended up living there and sort of seeing it from the other side and seeing how they view the U.S. and how present I think the U.S. is in people's lives in so many different ways, right? So when I was in high school and college, I really saw the power of U.S. soft power, whether that is, U.S. fast food chains or Hollywood, you name it. Those things really do shape how Taiwanese people think of the U.S. I would get asked by people, oh, do you really have these gigantic parties by the pool, in your big mansions? Is that really what high school life is like in the U.S.?
High School Musical.
I always said I wish. Unfortunately, not my experience. But so I think, on that front, sort of on the people level, I saw that. And then later on, in my sort of government job, right, I saw it at a policy level, right, where so many issues between the U.S. and Taiwan were impacting that relationship. And not just the biggest ticket items like defense and chips and things like that, but also maybe issues that we in the U.S. might not be thinking about on a day-to-day basis. So I think one example I can give is importing U.S. beef and pork, for instance. That has been and is a huge issue in Taiwan. Something that politically kind of across the spectrum was a really, there were lots of conversations and lots of debates about that. But, you and I here in Washington, D.C. may not have spent a lot of time thinking about where we are exporting our pork and beef to, right? And I think that's just kind of just a function of sort of the many issues here in the U.S. that we're thinking about that we may not even realize the size of the impact that can have.
Yeah, every time I open a menu in Taiwan, right at the beginning, there's something about how this pork is actually from Taiwan and is not from the U.S. or something to that extent. And I always chuckle to myself nervously. I'm like, oh, I've been eating American pork my whole life. Is that okay? Is something wrong? So I just find that very interesting. Yeah. One thing that came to mind when I was thinking about U.S. Taiwan relations is also just how in the U.S. People may or may not know about Taiwan. And so it's been very interesting to see how people now perceive of Taiwan in the U.S. One, I think, great enabler of that has been educational exchanges. My dad actually came here as an exchange student or an international student from Taiwan. And that, I think, is such a unique point. Taiwan, for its small size, has so many students studying in the United States. Some stay and end up, having their lives here. They found tech companies. They contribute a lot and they become Americans. And that has strengthened the ties tremendously. Some also end up going back to Taiwan. Some, perhaps named Morris Chang, go back and found the entire semiconductor industry, right? So there are all these people-to-people ties. I think there were some stats about Taiwan's international students that we found really interesting.
Yeah, I think while we were doing the research for this episode, we saw that Taiwan is actually the number 5 contributor of students to the U.S. higher education system.
That's insane.
Is considering Taiwan's
China,
size,
India.
It comes behind countries like China and India, but Taiwan, it's so small yet it's number 5, right? Another example might be sister city and sister state projects, right? I think Taiwan has you might be surprised. I would actually love for our listeners to look up what the nearest sister city you might have with Taiwan is. When we were getting ready for this episode, I learned actually that the state of Iowa is a sister state with Taiwan, and I was really excited to learn that because I wasn't aware of that, and yet I can really see sort of where those synergies come from across things like agriculture and education.
Yeah, I will give Taiwan's government a lot of credit. I think they've been very creative in ways to engage with the United States. I mean, I can only imagine from Taipei, right, that when they think about engaging with the United States, what does that mean? Is that in Washington with policymakers in D.C.? Is it in perhaps California or states with higher immigrant populations? How do they engage, right? Is it through local communities? Is it through the state government? I mean, I think the TSMC experience in Arizona really taught everybody, a lesson on how confusing our system, the American system, might be for outsiders, because TSMC learned, wait, it's not just the U.S. government or the people in Washington who are talking with us. We also have to speak with the state government, and there's a local government, there's a mayor, our entire system is very, very complex for people in Taiwan, which is again makes it, I think, more impressive that they've been able to make all these inroads. So yes, awesome that Iowa is also a sister state, city, state.
I think that is kind of a great segue into why we wanted to do this episode, right? There's just so much on both sides for us to learn about each other and so much for us to kind of better understand about each other. And we today really wanted to bring in an expert in those changes over the years, what's shaping them, where they're going. And so we're really excited today to be bringing in Chieh-Ting Yeh, who is the director of US Taiwan Watch. And US Taiwan Watch is kind of a mix of a think tank and a media creator, a civil society organization that is working basically to bring what is happening in the US to Taiwan and vice versa, sort of explain what's going on in Taiwan to the US.
Thank you, Ting, so much for joining us here in our studio. We are really excited to have you and to feature you and introduce US Taiwan Watch to our audience. I think our first question is, can you explain to us what is US Taiwan Watch? What does it do? And why was it created?
Sure. So unlike many public policy or kind of think tanks, U.S. Taiwan Watch actually started out as a hackathon project. So our 2 co-founders were actually software engineers that are also very passionate for Taiwan issues, Taiwan legislation advocacy, congressional advocacy in the United States. and they just felt that the tools for looking up legislation or tracking legislation in Congress is not very user friendly, and especially for people who want to know what's going on in Congress, especially around Taiwan. They wanted to basically create a online platform to track Taiwan-related bills and legislation resolutions in Congress. So that's how this project first got its start. And then over time, I think more political scientists, people who are in media, people who are interested in this topic in both Taiwan and in the United States joined the group. And so we've kind of evolved into a media slash think tank that primarily right now takes what is going on in the United States in terms of US China, US Taiwan developments, and then kind of digest that for an audience in Taiwan. So we have our feature podcast, a weekly news update podcast in Mandarin, and then we've also published a book actually in Taiwan a few years ago, just talking about kind of the U.S. Political system and also the history and kind of the current issues relating to U.S. Taiwan relations. So that is kind of the group in a nutshell. And we are also working very hard to try to do things in the reverse direction. So digest what is going on in Taiwan, the conversations happening around the U.S. In Taiwan, and digest that for a U.S. Interested audience.
Yeah, we definitely want to get into sort of what you're seeing on both sides of that conversation. But I think, spoiler alert, I will confess I am a listener of the podcast. I love
Big
the podcast.
fan.
Yeah, I love what you do. For any of our listeners who speak Chinese or want to practice their Chinese, I would highly recommend going and listening to it. It's really interesting to sort of learn and understand how our news is being understood by populations around the world, which I think your podcast does a great job of covering. But I thought maybe we could kind of take a step back and look at sort of how you got involved in all of this, because you have a really interesting story, right? You immigrated to the U.S. from Taiwan at a young age. You work in venture capital in California, but you're also really involved in all of these sort of Taiwanese political issues. How did that come about?
I should say I was born in Taiwan, grew up in Taiwan in the 80s, and moved to the U.S. to New York when I was 10 years old. And what had sort of happened to me during that time was in the 80s, so Taiwan was, for part of, so I tell people this, I lived through martial law in Taiwan, so it's not that long ago, I hope. But, we were, at least I was kind of taught in a very traditional, proper Chinese. Taiwan is the last bastion of free China. The map in my room shows, China as the ROC. And so there's a lot of things that I did not know until I came to the United States, right? So the first time I've seen a PRC flag was in the US. And that was like really shocking to me, right? And then so I kind of wonder to myself, like, okay, if these things weren't true that I learned, what else do I not know, right? And so, it's kind of like taking the red pill, right? And you kind of realize, okay, there's the kind of reality that you understood may not be actually true. So what is the truth, right? And so that's kind of how I became interested in Taiwan's political history. And also at the same time in the 90s, right? This is when Taiwan itself is undergoing massive changes, as well as sort of Taiwan, China, United States, right? So there's first direct presidential election in 1996, the Strait Crisis, 1999 special state-to-state relationship. And all of these things were kind of talked about in in the news in the U.S. And I've always sort of wondered, well, how come nobody asked me what the people from Taiwan thought about all of these issues, right? Long story short, I ended up going to law school because of my interest in Taiwan politics and international relations. So, that's kind of how I got into kind of the, I guess you would say, this field, but yet never felt like I was a sort of normal track, right? So I never really felt, well, I was a poli-sci academic, so I need to go into academia, or I was applying for a job at a think tank, right? So it was always sort of, I've always tried to look at it from almost an entrepreneurial angle where you can describe some of what I do as community organizing. So I've started a number of Taiwan organizations, NGOs. So Kathagala Media was one of them, Global Taiwan Institute, right here in DC. And I've been with the Formosan Association for Public Affairs, FAPA, for more than 10 years on the board. So that's kind of the community organizing part, but also sort of thinking about U.S. Taiwan relations, especially how to craft the narrative. How do you talk about Taiwan in the U.S. through media, think tank, grassroots advocacy, and sort of other types of organizations and activities that we have. So I would like to kind of think of everything as on a more holistic level. And I think uniquely that's what I'm positioned to do because I am not really completely part of just any one organization, right? So that's kind of what I like to do, I guess.
So I actually want to go back to something that you mentioned a little earlier in the conversation. You mentioned that you founded a media outlet called Katagalan Media, which in 2025 is now over a decade old. Founded in 2013, and it was really one of the first outlets that was doing kind of English language coverage of Taiwan on its own terms, right? So I would love if you could talk a little bit more about why you founded that.
So we started out as a podcast, and then immediately after we started in 2014, there was the Sunflower Movement. And so we were one of the first ones to kind of live stream, I guess before there were live streams.
You are really making moves. You founded podcasts. You introduced the live streaming.
Well, we were live blogging at least because we have friends who were in there who were at the scene and they were texting us pictures and videos and just kind of telling us what's going on. So we basically just put that on our site. And that's kind of how we got started. And I guess the media project kind of eventually would turn out to be a place where kind of advanced or ideas that might not be ready for the mainstream yet, right? When people write an article and then they say, well, you know what, like, no major outlet will publish this because this is kind of too out there. But we provide a place for people to do that, right? So that's one. It's also a place where I think, as you said, it was one of the very first outlets that treated Taiwan as a complete, robust entity, society, country that you can write about on its own, right? And so it's not a Chinese issue. It's not it's not always have to relate to China. And we wanted to talk about things that had nothing to do with tensions with China, right? So, but we still want to talk about that a little bit.
But yeah, I do want to switch, obviously over to the topic of conversation today, which is U.S. Taiwan relations. And of course, you're an expert on this in the sense that not only do you embody it, but, you've been following it for so long. So, I would like to ask you, what have been the major events that have happened in the last 2 decades that have really influenced the relationship, right? This could be political, this could be economic, anything tech related, right? What are the catalysts for maybe differences or changes in how either side has viewed the other?
I think obviously in the recent kind of 5 years, there's a lot of things, and I think those are kind of the type of things that people tend to focus on these days. So I'll get to them later, but if you kind of zoom out 20 years horizon, right? So I think some of the bigger trends in those 20 years include kind of how China has evolved and changed, right? So it kind of went from being seen as a potential partner or a kind of rising power that the United States has to at least give them the benefit of the doubt.
And I think the United States did.
Yes, and so and kind of up to now, I think people or sooner or later kind of realize that perhaps it didn't really work out the way we thought it would have, So I think that was one of the biggest trends in terms of how people see Taiwan, right? So that's one. I think two is, I think Taiwan, especially since 2016, when President Tsai Ing-wen came to power, I think so. She is not a very entertaining politician. She is. I mean, you met her.
Libby works for her
She's-
as a
worked for her.
speechwriter.
You work for her.
Yes.
Okay, so I shouldn't talk about your boss in those terms, but I mean, I think she would agree, right? But I think that's precisely her strength, right? And what kind of navigated Taiwan through sort of turbulent but also kind of narrow waters that Taiwan kind of has to, delicately navigate, right? Because she was so predictable and and dependable, and what you're getting with her, and I think that really embodied sort of Taiwan's like what I call quiet confidence, right? That I think really contributed a lot to the sort of changing U.S. perception of Taiwan. That Taiwan is a dependable partner, Taiwan is a reliable partner, and that Taiwan, is mature enough to knows what it wants and knows where realistically how far they can get with what they want at what time, right? And so I think that really contributed to U.S. Taiwan relations in a positive way as well. And I think the third thing I would kind of mention in the 20-year horizon is, again, I would like to think we have something to do with this, but just sort of the realization that Taiwan is somewhat unique and different and can be talked about separate from China, right? And so this obviously includes the culture, the history, the music, the food, and I think there's just a steady buildup of you might call influencers or people who are in those fields, completely away from Washington, completely away from geopolitics, but talking about Taiwan in those terms as well, right? So, food magazines would talk about Taiwan. I think I want to say they're probably one of the earliest people to talk about Taiwan's history as as a colonial sort of crossroads of empires, and that's why the food is interesting, and that's why the food is sort of Chinese, but not exactly Chinese. And, I think that's actually where a lot of this vocabulary, a lot of where this narrative about Taiwan really started. It's from, area like places like that. So I would say in the past 20 years that those are kind of the larger trends. Obviously, the past 5-10 years, semiconductors, right, COVID, security, and I think the interesting thing to me is that all of these things like existed before 5 years ago. Taiwan has been making semiconductor chips for decades, and we've just been, very quietly. Well, Taiwan has been very quietly just we're gonna make these things and not cause any trouble. And then all of a sudden, everybody realized like, oh, you guys are the ones that make these things, and so that's why it's such a big issue now, right?
Mm-hmm.
But those things obviously existed, and I think it's the way people think about Taiwan, look at Taiwan, that has quite changed a lot.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's, an interesting sort of trajectory over 20 years, but also things have, as you said, kind of really sped up and been condensed maybe over the past 5-ish years. And I would love to maybe flip the question on its head and think about how Taiwanese people see the U.S. and how they see the relationship and how, especially these rapid changes over the past few years, have changed those views.
So I think with the United States, the way I would characterize how Taiwanese society thinks about the U.S. is really around the question of how good of a friend is the United States. And I think the sort of general answer subconsciously in most people's minds in Taiwan is the United States is a friend, but there are ups and downs. And we might be in an upswing, we might be in a downswing. But whatever it is, United States is usually a friend, usually a pretty good friend, but they're a big friend. So we have to
They have a lot of friends. Yeah.
we have to, really pay attention to what they want or what they need, right? Um, and so I think that's sort of the basic framework of how people think about the United States. Um, Obviously, again in the last 5 to 10 years, right, with the United States and China, um, kind of shifting towards more of a rivalry type of stance, right? I think with Taiwan, what basically I would say is like this. So Taiwan basically follows America's lead, right? And when America was friendly to China, Taiwan was friendly to China, along with the United States, right? And so that really looked like Taiwan was being friendly to the U.S. and China. But then when the United States started to focus more on the rivalry, the competitive part of that relationship, then Taiwan really kind of has to decide. Do we follow America's lead, or do we say, no, actually we have factors that pull us to China more than the United States? So I think that's, in a very sort of rough, simplified way, is how people in Taiwan might think about the U.S.
Yeah, I also want to ask you a question about how different generations have viewed this, because I think specifically for Taiwan, the generation in which you grew up, and where, right, whether where you were, whether you were in Taiwan or you were in the U.S., and again, in which generation, I think really shapes your view. Of course, born and raised in California, learn about Taiwan and everything like that through my parents and my family and that lens, right? My parents who were born in Taiwan have a specific view, my grandparents, right, et cetera. So I think that's every generation has their own story, especially due to this very, very recent history. So I would just be curious to ask you, right, how have these views of U.S. Taiwan relations differed across generations? Perhaps how have younger generations viewed this relationship in contrast to older generations? And maybe, if you want to speak from your generation, right, how do you see this generational view?
So I remember talking to my grandmother about this. So she's not with us anymore. She was born in 1925. And so, she went through the war. Taiwan's part of Japan at the time, and it was being bombed by American bombers, right? And so she would, and then she obviously came to the U.S., right, later years of her life. And I don't think she ever thought, the U.S. was like an enemy, right? But it's just okay, well, they are, the United States is the almost like the last word in global affairs, right? And so no matter what it is, you kind of have to dance with the United States. I think my parents, of course, they went through I think the defining event for them is probably 1979 when U.S. broke diplomatic relations, or 1971 when Taiwan left or was ejected from the United Nations. But I don't think I don't think that really colored and kind of became in their mind what the U.S. is evil, right? Because sort of aside from all of that, the kind of politics and kind of the Taipei, Washington, or kind of on the governmental diplomatic level, right? They still thought, well, America's a land of opportunity, right? America is where our kids would get the most advanced education, right? The most, if they want to advance in society, we need to take them to the U.S. That's where the wealth is. So there's still, obviously American pop culture, right? That's in Taiwan, at least when I was growing up, that was, like something from abroad, right? That was like, wow, this is like so much better than what we have. So yeah, I think for the younger generation, especially the people who are kind of voting for the first time, for example, I think they sort of grew up in a time where they did not experience the Cold War or martial law like myself, even though I was a kid. They did not experience a lot of this kind of historical stuff that I just mentioned, right? So then they're looking at the United States, and their baseline for how good of a friend is the U.S. Is quite different from people from other generations, right? And so, and their sort of basic assumption of the United States is a little bit different. So, I won't presume I can speak for them, but I think they're looking at the United States, and again asking themselves that same question, right? But just with a sort of very different frame of reference.
I'd love to pull on that thread of assumptions that you just mentioned, and you've spent so much of your time working on these issues from a media perspective or a policy perspective, basically making Taiwan legible to the U.S. and vice versa, right? And so I would love if you could talk about from that vantage point, what are some of the persistent kind of misconceptions that you see maybe on the U.S. side about Taiwan? What are people getting wrong?
So I think this is something that you will hear quite a lot, which is, are people in Taiwan too relaxed about their threat level, or are people in Washington freaking out too much, right?
We asked that question
Yes.
too.
Right? And I don't have a great answer to that, but something in between, right? Because you always, I've had to hear this story about from multiple people who have family in the U.S., right? They're studying abroad in Taiwan, and they're like, my mom calls me and she's like, "Are you gonna be safe? Are you going to be able to run away? Are you going to be able to?" And he's like, "No, nothing is happening here. It's like, we just went to eat, like we just went drinking just now." Whereas you hear people, especially kind of on the policy discussions here, where it's like, "Oh, Taiwanese people are not taking their threat level seriously. They're not investing in their defense, blah blah blah," right? I think the two sides may be able to come towards each other a little bit more. Kind of on the Taiwanese side, right? I remember, again, when I was a kid, there was a book that came out in Taiwan that was like huge bestseller, right? It was basically, it's gonna happen in 1995. That's basically like the gist of the book. And I mean, it's not, it predicts through, traditional folk, cosmology, right? Like, if you look at the calendar and the stars, and this
Like
is
the Mayan calendar
it's like
and
2012,
right?
yeah.
Or the savior is coming, right? So it's a little bit like that, but it got a lot of play, right? Because that was also the time when the first direct presidential elections were happening, and people thought, okay, that was the red line, right? But it didn't happen, right? And so the point is, not since then, but since 1949, maybe even before that, right? 1949, 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010, 2020s. We've lived, well, the Taiwanese people have lived in that heightened state of, we're still technically at war, right? And that's kind of passed down, kind of filtered or diluted through many generations, where to the point where people are now like, yes, we get it, okay? Like, you kind of just figured out that we were under threat like 5 years ago. We've been doing this for like 80, 90 years, if not more, right? To the point where like we can't really think about that. But again, I think to give a little credit on the other side of the coin, right? Because there's just been this peace, relative peace, or kind of absence of violence, right, between the two sides for so long that I think people tend to forget, one, that it wasn't that long ago, and two, if it really happens, how bloody and violent and how devastating it really could be. And I think, for people in Taiwan, yes, I think, there is room to definitely take the threat more seriously, or maybe I wouldn't put it in those terms. Maybe I would say, there is a need for people to kind of think about those issues more, in a sort of more serious matter, or in a more urgent matter. But then, kind of at the same time, for Washington to understand that this is not new to Taiwan. Sure, China might be a little bit more aggressive and might talk about it, but people in Taiwan have been living under this kind of threat more or less for several generations, right? And we have to go about our business, right? We have to act and live as a normal functioning society and country, right? So I think the two sides can kind of walk towards each other a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always the challenge from a policymaker's perspective, or I mean, I guess since we're sitting here in the DC area, right? If you successfully provide security to your people, they actually should not be worried about a threat, right? If as a government, you're able to provide that security and successfully, make your dollars worth it, right? If we're talking about defense spending, then yeah, people should actually live safely. They should not have to worry. And then, of course, the other side is people will say, why are we spending so much money on defense and security? We are living a happy life. It's fine. It's going to be okay, right? So I think that's always a struggle, whether it's in Taiwan's legislature, even in our, in the U.S. system, right? People are always talking about these trade-offs because it is really hard, especially now if let's say from the U.S. perspective, we are trying to get other countries to increase their defense spending, right? They're having those questions. Well, then I need to spend money on XYZ, on healthcare, as we've discussed in the past. So yeah, it's always, I think, a tough question. On the flip side of that, we are also curious, right? What are the misperceptions of the United States in Taiwan?
I think in Taiwan, people tend to consciously or unconsciously think of the United States as one kind of thing, like as one entity, right? In the sense that anything that somebody in the United States say, they kind of attribute that to, well, the United States said this, right? But it could just be one professor from one university that actually is trying to disagree with what the administration is doing, right? And I don't think it's the fact that people in Taiwan doesn't know how separation of powers and how the government works. I think it's just the way that international relations is kind of talked about. We tend to personify a country, right? When we talk about, right, Russia decides to do this, Ukraine decides to do that, France decides to do this, like the U.S. decides to do that. But no, they're not one person. They're many people and making decisions and all disagreeing with each other and arguing with each other and millions of people, thinking about these.
For most of the countries that you named.
Yeah. So I think I think in Taiwan, right, and again, I think one of the things is they see reports or quotes coming out of people from the U.S. and then they very quickly kind of conclude that, okay, that is the position of the United States, or that is a signal that the United States is trying to send, or that is a sort of a game that they're playing, right? We need to figure out what they mean. So that's, I think, one. I think two is, and I think this is more of a cultural thing, right? So personification of the country, right? And also, I think there's a tendency in Taiwan society to kind of assume that the policies are not just rational, but they are multi-layered, and there's this big 3D chess game that the leader is playing, and we don't know why something's happening because we can't understand it, but the president knows exactly what he or she is doing, right? And I just wanted to say, I think we'll be lucky if a policy comes out and has some semblance of logic, right? Because 600 hands get on it and people argue, and there's a give and take, and that's how policy is made in a democratic country, right? And so I think people in Taiwan, they look at things in the lens of, right, we need to decide how good of a friend is the U.S., right? And so in that process, a lot of things get necessarily simplified, but perhaps oversimplified. So I think, and they're like, well, the U.S. is the biggest country, the strongest country. They must know what they're doing. And you come to D.C. and you say that, and people kind of laugh at you, right? So
appreciate the confidence around the world, or at least in certain parts of the world.
No, but I'm saying that's the definition how democracy should work, right? It's messy in Taiwan, it's messy in the United States. Whatever comes out might not necessarily be the best according to any one person, but that's what we have. So.
Yeah. No, and I love actually your point on the first part about how, Taiwanese people are often looking for some kind of signal. And I think that that speaks to maybe sort of past experience with the US Taiwan relationship where interactions have been so limited through kind of formal channels. They've been sort of circumscribed. And so that kind of naturally leads people to look for signals wherever they can find them. And I think that, that's something that has changed quite a bit in the past few years as these channels have opened up. And of course, people like yourself and your organizations like US Taiwan Watch, I think have played a big role in doing that and in opening up the field of what's possible for how the U.S. and Taiwan can interact. But I would love now to kind of think going forward into the future. Obviously, you are sort of a serial entrepreneur in the U.S. Taiwan space. I would love to hear what you're thinking of as the next step. What can we do? What are opportunities to increase that aperture between the U.S. and Taiwan? What are some avenues people might not even be thinking about yet?
So kind of coming from where I am in the Bay Area, right, Silicon Valley, we talk about semiconductors, and I think there is a lot more in generally what we call technology, right, and a lot more in what we might call capital deployment, right? So mutual investments from one side to the other. How do we kind of open up? I think specifically Taiwan. How do we open up our financial systems to allow for more? Especially, I think on the Taiwan side, for more risk taking and for Taiwan to, for Taiwanese capital really to be more valuable and sought after around the world. I think from a sort of a business and tech perspective, that's something that I'd be interested in working on more myself. And I think in terms of other things kind of going forward, right? We kind of talked about the culture and tourism or food and things like that. Obviously, I would like to see more high quality Taiwanese, cultural products, music, TV shows, movies, become more kind of household names in the U.S. And also for people in the U.S. just to say, okay, you know what, like Taiwan is a great place. Taiwan's a cool place. Nice people, and they're really our friend. I think I would say that's generally, I would assume that's probably generally true across this country, like very generally speaking, right? But I think the narrative about how we talk about Taiwan, especially with these more serious security, economic, technological questions, is how do we mitigate or how do we manage the challenges that the Taiwan situation presents to the United States, right? To the point where it seems that Taiwan is still a problem, right? The framework is, yes, U.S. Taiwan relations have gotten better. There's much more attention being paid to Taiwan, but that's because we realize that it's actually a much bigger problem than we had previously thought, right? And I would like to see that turned around, right? To say, okay, what are our problems that Taiwan can help us deal with, right? How can we see Taiwan as not a liability, but an asset? How do we see Taiwan as a partner, right, and not an issue, right? That is something I would like to see going forward. I don't have all the answers as to how to do them. Otherwise, I would be getting my Nobel Peace Prize, right? But
we'll interview you again after you win it.
Once you figured it all out. Yes.
Right. No. But the point is, everybody, all of you guys, should, I would love for us to all work on this together, right? I'm pretty optimistic that that is where things are going, if we all sit down and work on it.
What a great note to kind of finish out on. I personally feel motivated. I think that's really what we wanted to do here with Strait Forward is really bring the Taiwanese, conversation to a broader audience and sort of just kind of have those fuller conversations. So I'm really glad that you ended it on that note of we can all do something really regardless of where we are.
Eat more dumplings. We do have one more question for you. We like to ask all of our listeners to recommend something from Taiwan to our listeners because like we just talked about, right, Taiwan's always been talked about in certain contexts, perhaps not all. And so we are trying to share different aspects of Taiwan with our audience. So if you have one recommendation or two, but one, two recommendations about Taiwan, it could be a movie, a book, TV show, food. What would it be?
Okay. Wow. One or two. I do have a book.
Came prepared.
Happens to have it right here. This is actually a book. This is actually a book that U.S. Taiwan Watch, our co-editors, wrote, published in Taiwan in Chinese. But it's basically meant to be a crash course on U.S. Taiwan relations and how the U.S. government works and how policy is sort of made in America.
And what is it called for our listeners who are only listening?
Yes, this is called Why and How the U.S. Matters. The Mandarin title is 为什么我们要在意美国? So you can find it in all major bookstores in Taiwan and online. And if I were to recommend, I would actually, I thought about this question the most since I got your questions in the mail. I would like to recommend people take a trip to my hometown in Daxi. So Daxi is not really on anybody's tourist map. It's not like even kind of the first, second, or third place that people think to go. But it is, I think it is quite a magical place. It's sort of where all the different cultures and histories of Taiwan kind of intersect. It's at the foothills between where Han settlers and indigenous peoples meet. It's where a lot of the 19th century goods from Taiwan, like camphor, like lumber, right? All of these things were floated downstream to Dadaoteng, where then they're sold to places like in Europe and America. And it's just a really pretty place with good food and a lot of history. And it's I don't know. I think a lot of what my passion for Taiwan really comes from. I think a big part of that is really kind of nostalgia for and knowing that like that history and that heritage, is passed down to me and to us, right? And how do we kind of keep that, and how do we kind of write the next chapter, right? And so that thinking about that kind of just really inspires me. And so I would recommend anybody, if you're going to Taiwan, find your way to Daxi. So.
Yeah, full disclosure, I used to live in Taoyuan, so I have been to Daxi. It has a great old street where you can do lots of eating and shopping and looking at the beautiful architecture and history that's there. So fully endorse this recommendation.
Looks like Libby will be taking a tour group.
Yes.
So sign-ups are available on
Sign
our
myself
website. I'm kidding. Well, thank you so much, Ting, for our conversation today, for sharing all of your personal insights and being open with us, right, in our audience, but also inspiring, of course, Libby and myself, but just people all over the U.S. and Taiwan and around the world over the last decade, more than that, on this really important topic. So we really look forward to staying in touch. And thank you again.
Thanks for having me.
Libby, I think that was such a wonderful conversation in the sense that, of course, Ting has all this experience with following the U.S. Taiwan relationship, but also the perspective that he brings, right? We, whether it's at a CSP or in D.C. or in these policy circles, spend so much time, and rightfully so, right, thinking about the national security issues, the defense issues, the tech issues. Again, we have to think about these things. But the people-to-people ties are so important to the U.S. Taiwan relationship. Right? I think people often forget that it really is the communities, the people who don't actually think that much about tech, or maybe work in tech but don't think about it through that large geopolitical lens. Right? And again, conversely, the people who work on policy and geopolitics that might not think as much about the people-to-people ties. Right? It is all of the people involved in this relationship that makes it so fruitful. And that end up enriching, not only those people-to-people ties themselves, but also kind of the relationship between Washington and Taipei.
Yeah, no, I really liked the part at the end where he kind of gave agency back to all of us, right? He mentioned that neither of our countries is like a monolith. You know, it is not just the US does something and Taiwan does something in response, right? We each kind of, no matter where we are in this space, have a role that we can play in thinking about how our actions might impact the US Taiwan relationship, how we can, bring this partnership closer together. And so I really appreciated that. I felt, it really, I think, feeds quite well into our goals with Strait Forward, with this podcast itself. That's exactly what I think we had been hoping to achieve. And so I think hearing it from someone like Ting, who's been in this space for so long and in so many different capacities, I felt like that was really just heartening to hear.
So it's great because we're not alone, they're not alone. We're all in this together. I think that's the exciting part about it. Again, very much based on the values that we share. And, again, like you mentioned, it is why we're bringing all these stories. So thank you to the audience for tuning in. But thank you to Ting for joining us on this episode. So we look straight forward to seeing you next time.